everyone. I hope you're all having a good week. This week's video I think is going to be somewhat short because we don't have a lot of concepts to go over. The readings for this week were more reflective, and you were allowed to sort of use your positionality to consider them rather than, like the Sorrell's textbook is typically like full of concepts that I try to pick from and sort of go in depth into. So what we're going to do is we're going to get into the Big Uneasy first, and I'll just spend a little bit of time giving you some feedback on your questions that you answered, and then we'll get into the bell hooks reading after that. All right, so the goals that I have is we'll talk a little bit about diversity in relation to marginalized students, then we'll get into the concept of norm entrepreneurs, and then finally I'll get to the Hooks article where I'll give you a little bit more background on who Bell Hooks is, and I will also engage with parts of the text to give you a little bit of my perspective as far as the relationship with class and class mobility. But a lot of you already have some really great responses as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So to start things off, usually when we have like a face-to-face class, what we spend some time doing is defining different terms from the text, like not just terms like diversity, but also like the difference between diversity and inclusion. We try to define some important terms like different identity terms, what it means to be ableist, all of those things. But for the sake of time, I want to focus on a few things that relate to the reading questions that you had to do. So the first thing that I want to focus on is the way that diversity plays a role in how we understand our college. So when we talk about diversity, and this is actually like something that I do a lot of research on, but a lot of times the way we talk about it as it's something that's like a selling point. It's something that makes us look good. We like to be able to say that we have this diverse student body because we know that, when you have a diverse student body or you have a diverse workplace, you're going to have all of these different perspectives to learn from. And that can be really valuable when you're trying to create sort of innovative designs, but it can also be really valuable in your just your formation of your own identity. What this article is sort of getting at is the way that when universities pride themselves on diversity, what sometimes ends up happening is that the students who are representing diversity, so in other words, marginalized students like students of color, trans students, queer students, sometimes women, et cetera, they tend to do a lot of the diversity work for the college. So for example, in an intercultural communication class, what this article is trying to say is that in those classes, sometimes the people who have to do the work are the non-white, non-cis, those who are able-bodied, etc. They are the ones or those who are not able-bodied, they are the ones who end up having to like talk about their own experiences, explain, oh, this is what it means to have an invisible disability. This is what it means to be this. This is what it means to be this. And while that can be useful sometimes, it can also be problematic because we're putting even more work onto these students. And so your article is being very critical about the way universities are sort of exploiting some students, right? And that doesn't mean that all of these students are taking on the burden, right? In fact, some of this article, what's really interesting is some of them have chosen to sort of surround themselves by people who are just like them because they're tired of doing the work for everyone else. And so the reason why I assigned this is I did want to give you a chance to reflect on times when sometimes you might, if maybe you have more privilege, the privilege allows for you to sort of disengage from conversations and then just rely on other people to sort of teach you the lesson for you. And I mean, I'm not talking about teachers because that's sort of our job, but think about how often it is where you expect other people to teach you about their identity, where you could spend some time like doing research on that before engaging So yeah, there's no really right or wrong way of doing this. It's just important that we recognize when there might be too much of an emotional burden for some marginalized individuals. And so I'll stop there with this. Usually in class, we talk about this idea of a safe space and how that's a really problematic term because for some marginalized students, they're never going to feel safe. There's no option of like creating a safe environment because they're always feeling like unsafe. So especially in like a classroom setting or in public places. And so I try to think about a classroom as like a brave space where we can all feel like we're really willing to be a little bit uncomfortable and willing to sort of make ourselves uncomfortable to learn. And I think sometimes that's the only way that we are going to learn. So on the flip side, I think safe spaces can be useful, but I don't think that classrooms can necessarily be them. Sometimes a safe space can be a place that's like a segregated space where you choose, like there are some college dorms that are only for Black students, right? And this is, for some Black students, this is really important because they can just simply be themselves without people asking them to touch their hair, right? Or asking them about their experience on campus. Here in this sort of segregated safe space, they are sort of just being. And so this is something that I think is interesting because it's, as someone who has a lot of privilege, it's something that I never really had to experience, for the most part at least, although there are some settings where I do feel unsafe. But anyways, hopefully this allows for you to build a little bit of an understanding about why some people sort of go to these secluded areas in order to feel more comfortable. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about with this particular reading is this idea of norm entrepreneurs. So the reason why this reading brings this up at the end is if there's going to be a way for marginalized students to feel like they're doing less of the work, there's going to need to be norm entrepreneurs. So in other words, people who are willing to shift the norms that we have in our society. So something that I think your article is trying to argue is that rather than brand yourself, like your university on diversity, it could be more useful to work towards inclusion of different perspectives. So working on that in the curriculum, and not just in intercultural classes, but in other parts of the curriculum as well. Working towards that would definitely mean, you know, allyship, would definitely mean trying to build sort of a coalition with other people. But your article seems to be optimistic that this is something that is possible. And in fact, what your article is trying to say with this idea of norm entrepreneurs is every generation is a norm entrepreneur. So some of you are like, no, I'm not really. You definitely can be. And in fact, I think that they would argue that almost everyone who's young is, because we are all shifting the norms. Or I say we like I'm young, I'm not that young anymore, but we're shifting the norms of society. So even like maybe not in the level of like diversity or inclusion in the university, but the fact that many of you grew up like having the internet your whole lives, right? So you are starting to shift the way that we communicate because so many of you communicate in such a different way compared to people of my generation or even older, right? I grew up with like, I didn't have the internet until I was like 16, and I didn't have like real access to it until I was like 18, like in college. So norm entrepreneurs are typically young people who are making us shift and adapt to what they have to say. And the statistics show that young people today, because of the access to social media and the internet, they typically are more open-minded. And so these norm entrepreneurs might allow for universities to start to shift and become more inclusive, and not just diverse, but inclusive of all of these different perspectives. Okay, so there's no right or wrong on whether you're a norm entrepreneur, but I would tell you that this article leans towards almost all young people are, because they are shifting something, even if it's not like super purposeful. I think one of you answered that you were sort of passive in this. Some people are passive, but they're still helping us shift these norms. So yeah. All right, so let's go ahead and move on, and we're going to talk about bell hooks. So this particular article is our transition into starting to talk about identity. So I usually start with class, and then next week what we're going to be getting into is we'll have the Sorrell's reading, but we're also going to be talking about race and ethnicity. and we'll be talking about gender as well. So this is sort of our first introduction to the different identities that we'll be talking about. So the first one that we'll get to is an article from Bell Hooks. So some of you may have heard about her. She's typically known in, she's typically taught in like feminist classes, sometimes in literary classes. She is a second wave feminist, and she is known for trying to bring in more individuals into feminism. Like there's a really great book that she wrote called Feminism is for Everyone. She's written some articles that show that men should be feminists, and this was written in like the early 80s. So this was something that she was doing before all of this like conversation about intersectionality became so popular in these last 10 or so years. So she's someone that is widely respected in the feminist community, as well as in the intercultural scholarship. But I wanted to use her for this particular conversation because I connect a lot with her on her discussions about class. So when I read this article a long time ago, for me, it was one of the first feminist readings that I sort of really understood, because for me, feminism, most feminists, especially like middle class white feminists, didn't really speak to me because I grew up in sort of a working class, low income community. And so I shared a lot with her. She gave you a lot of like her biography in this reading. So you know that she grew up in sort of the Midwest in Kentucky. She grew up in a working class community. She's the first person in her family to go to college. And then when she went to college, she really went to college. So she didn't just like stay in her home. She went to college in California. And in fact, when she went to grad school, she went to a couple of other places on the East Coast. And her family had a hard time understanding why she would want to go so far away, because she had such a close-knit family. And so I had hoped, and this is why I assigned this, I had hoped that more of you could sort of connect with some of her experience. Yes, she's writing about a time before many of us grew up, right? So she talks about when she had to go through busing. So she was bused to different schools, right? She actually went to segregated schools for a while, and then when she was in like middle school, she ended up going to an integrated school, and she got to experience both of those things, right? Which I think is something obviously that many of us haven't had to experience. But you all said that you had at least some similarities with her experience. So I want to highlight a couple of things that are really important in this particular reading. So the first one, I don't think she uses this term, but this whole article is about this concept of class mobility. So in other words, like being able to move, we're talking about moving from like the working class background to sort of a upper middle class to even like the high income bracket. And while many of us hope to do that, we sometimes don't realize how much of a struggle it can be moving from sort of low income to upper income. And she is really getting at that struggle. Even, I think what's especially important is that when she talks about going to college, where she's still, she's getting scholarships for sure, but she's still from that working class background. She's interacting with people who are upper middle class, and she's sort of seeing the way that they treat people like janitors, right? Or they treat even their teachers. She's sort of thrown off by sort of the lack of respect, even the way that they treat their family. She's like, what in the world is this, right? And so what she ends up having to do is seclude herself. And this isn't even about like building a safe space going to other people, but she didn't really know anyone else who had shared her experience. And so one thing that's really important for those of us who hope to move up is when we do move up, we have to recognize the value of trying to find other people who share this experience, because it can be harder than I think we realize. The other thing that I want to identify that I think is really interesting is the way that she talks about language and how she's had to sort of twist her language in different ways. So one way she talks about this is like she has a strong accent, and she still has an accent today, although I'm guessing it was much stronger when she had first started college. But she ended up feeling very self-conscious about her accent. And I know in this class, some of you have talked about that as well, right? And so this was something that I think sort of hurt her confidence for a while. But what she ended up doing was she sort of took that like lack of confidence at first, and she said, actually, like, this language is a part of who I am, right? So my accent is not something I want to let go of, because it reminds people that I am from another place, right? And it makes me feel like I'm still part of that place. So even though I am being mobile and I'm moving around, I still have a connection to my home. And I think that that's a really valuable lesson for some of us who might struggle with language. For me, my family is from Indiana, so we don't have a strong Southern accent, but we do sort of have this like small rural, like just weird way of talking. And every once in a while, like, I get caught up in the way that they talk, even though I've been away from home for 15 years. And that can be a struggle, right? For those of you who maybe English is your second language, it's happening in a different way, right? And probably a harder way than for me or bell hooks. But there is some connection with this idea of language. The other thing I really like about the way that she sort of flipped the script on her, I guess, language problem was when she publishes in academic journals, or like this article here, she actually tries to use language that people who are from where she's from could understand. So in other words, she's not interested in like that academic fancy pants language, because, you know, if she's really trying to make change, she's trying to talk to people who are from her community. And I think that that's really powerful, and it's something that she got criticized for quite a bit. And I mean, she's adapted a little bit, but she's, for the most part, like if you look at most of her books, she doesn't use things like in-text citations, because that's something she feels like alienates the people in her community. And she uses really straightforward language. She talks about herself a lot, which allows for people to sort of connect with her. And I think that all of that is really valuable and speaks to how important home is, despite the fact that she left her home, right? Which obviously was really hard for her family, and it was hard for her as well. Sorry, there's a plane going over, so I'm sorry if that got a little loud. Okay. You all talked a lot about the first generation college students. You all talked a lot about like family not understanding her going to college, especially so far away. So I'm glad you found some other connections. Hopefully what I just talked about allowed for you to build a few more connections. Either way, you all, you know, did really well exploring your positionality and how that affected the way you read her. And hopefully, hopefully this helps you better understand your experience here at CSUN. And that's all I have for you this week. As always, thank you so much for listening. And I am always happy to answer any questions that you have through email, or I'm happy to make a Zoom online chat appointment if that's something you're interested in too. So thanks again, and have an awesome week.